I'm Hayley, and this is the next in our Rhythm for Life series. We're still in Bible month, so we're looking at the book of Ruth, and I will be reading to us today from Ruth chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor, and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. Ruth chapter 3 can be one of those parts of the Bible that leave us feeling a little bit uncomfortable, that leave us with more questions than answers. And sometimes it would be easier to gloss over bits of the Bible that are like that, bits of the Bible that challenge us, bits of the Bible that don't sit well with how we understand things to be today, bits of the Bible that we kind of can just sometimes try to put into history. But actually, Paul says to Timothy that all scripture is useful for teaching. Even the bits that are difficult to understand, even the bits that leave us feeling uncomfortable, have a lot to teach us. And so I don't want us to rush through chapter 3, but I want us to sit with it. So the context that Ruth and Naomi live in is one of patriarchy. And within patriarchy, unfortunately, women suffer oppression. Women are almost second-class citizens. They are property of their fathers and then their husbands. They have no rights of their own, and they definitely have no rights of inheritance. And a single woman without a husband or without a father to look after her is very vulnerable and potentially destitute. And so this is the context that Ruth and Naomi find themselves in, a context where men hold all of the power and that a man is needed to really be looked after well. Now, in the patriarchy system, it is true that men hold the power. Men can make the decisions. Men can inherit the land. Men can make choices about what women can and can't do and how their lives are going to be. But also, alongside that power, they are given responsibilities. And one of my favorite quotes ever, and it's from Spider-Man, is that with great power comes great responsibility. And the men of this time have responsibilities thrust upon them. They are called to look after the widow, the orphan, the alien, those in need. And we see a little bit of that with the law about the fields and leaving food for the poor and the needy to pick so that they do not go hungry. But actually there's another law within the Israelite law that is also about looking after the widow, and that's this law of the kinsman redeemer. And basically what it means is that if a woman dies and she has been married and becomes a widow without having children, then her nearest male relative is required to marry her to offer that protection, because kind of the covering and the protection only come from a man in this society, but also so that she can have children, and the man that's died line can be continued, the land can continue to pass through the family, and his genealogy will be continued into the future. And that is the responsibility that is placed on the Israelite community, to which Ruth and Naomi return. But what we see is that they are not living up to this responsibility, because no kinsman redeemer comes forward for Ruth. And so the Israelites are not acting up to the responsibilities that they have on them and the things that are required of them. And so we see Ruth and Naomi no longer hungry because they've had food from Boaz's field, but actually still pretty destitute. And Naomi knows that if something doesn't change, then they will be desolate for the rest of their lives. And she says to Ruth, "Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well for you?" Naomi wants Ruth to be settled. She wants Ruth to be looked after and cared for and have the protection that only a husband can offer, so that she will have a future and she will have life. And Naomi knows that in doing that for Ruth, she is also doing it for herself. But no kinsman redeemer has come forward. And so Naomi and Ruth together come up with this plan to do something about it. They take the situation into their own hands and they act. And Naomi says to Ruth, "Get yourself all dressed up, get yourself clean, put your nice clothes on, go down to the threshing floor where Boaz is, wait until he goes to sleep. Go to him, uncover his feet, lay there, wait until he wakes, and then do what he says." And Ruth responds, "I will do all that you say." And so we see her go to the threshing floor. We see her uncovering Boaz's feet and lying there waiting for him. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not an easy thing for Ruth to do. This isn't a nice, clean, pleasant situation. This would have been difficult. This would have been a risky encounter, a risky endeavor. We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know how Boaz is going to respond in the situation. We've got a clue about how Boaz might respond because of his character that we've seen and the way he's protected Ruth so far. But we don't know what is going to happen between Boaz and Ruth in this encounter. Naomi doesn't know what Boaz might do to Ruth in the middle of the night. So there is risk for Ruth in going into this encounter. And in the same way, Ruth's reputation is at risk. If she is seen by anybody, then the reputation of being this faithful and kind woman will be torn to shreds. She will no longer have any standing within the community. And so this whole adventure is fraught with risk for Ruth. But there is no other option. There is no other way out. Now, there are all kinds of connotations around what this encounter means and what actually happened. And lots of people have lots of different opinions on what this whole story means. But what can be safely said is that we don't know for sure exactly what happened between Ruth and Boaz. But we know that there was this intimate and private encounter between the two of them in the middle of the night. And it might not have been the most pleasant thing for Ruth to have to do. I really want you to hold on to that. We can't always clean up stories of the Bible, but there was no other good option for Ruth or Naomi at this time. So Ruth has done what has been asked of her. She's at his feet waiting, and then he wakes up. He wakes up and she's been told to wait and to hear what he has to say and then respond. But Ruth doesn't do that. Ruth doesn't wait for Boaz to wake up and tell her what to do. When Boaz wakes, Ruth just starts speaking. Ruth starts asking for what is required to her. She says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Ruth is bold, and she's basically saying to Boaz, marry me, protect me, give me everything that is required of the law. It is your duty and it is my right. It is what I'm owed under the Israelite law. She demands what is due to her. And we know that Boaz so far has been a pretty decent guy, but actually we see that he does not disappoint us, and he lives up to those expectations that we have had of him. And he says, it is true that I am a redeemer. I will do all that you ask. And isn't that great? Boaz responds, yes, I will do what is required of me. I will do what you've asked of me. I will do what is owed to you. And in this whole story, Ruth and Naomi are victims of this patriarchal system. They're victims of not having any power for themselves and needing someone else to step in and help them. And Boaz recognizes, although it takes him a while, he recognizes that it is his responsibility to do something about it. So he is going to go to the other man who is the closer kinsman and see if he wants to redeem Ruth. And if that man doesn't, Boaz promises that he will marry her instead. Now, we live in a world where there are still injustices, where there are still inequalities, where there are still oppression and prejudice and awful things happening to people all over the world that takes away their safety, their security, their food, their shelter, their freedom, their choice, their future, where people can expect protection from the people that are meant to protect them, or care from the people who are meant to care for them. People live in awful situations right the way throughout our world. And just like Ruth and Naomi, they are driven to desperate actions because there seems to be no other way out. And if only the Israelites had done their duty in the beginning, Ruth would never have had to get to this situation. Ruth would never have had to have done this by going to Boaz in this way if the Israelites had only done what they should. And in our world, many injustices take place in the same way because the people who should have done the right thing have not stepped up. And so when I read this chapter of Ruth, I read the challenge for how we respond to these people like Ruth and Naomi, and to the situations like the ones Naomi and Ruth find themselves in. Do we recognize one another's common humanity? Do we recognize one another's needs? Do we recognize the situations and structures and inequalities that are oppressive and prejudice to our fellow humans? Do we recognize the inequalities and the injustices that are taking place around our world today? And do we recognize the power and the privilege that many of us in the Western world hold? And what does it mean, therefore, with that power and that privilege for us to act on the responsibilities that come with that power and privilege? Do we understand the responsibilities that each of us hold? Do we need to open our eyes to what is happening in the world? Do we need to listen to the stories of people experiencing oppression in all its forms? Do we need to educate ourselves? Do we need to stand up with and for those that need us? And how can we offer that protection and provision and all that goes with it that Boaz offers to Ruth? What is it that we have to offer today? And how can we use our privilege responsibly? Boaz was a good man, but it took Ruth's desperate actions to get him to act. Let's not be people who wait for desperate actions of others before we do the right thing. Instead, let us be proactive that we may act now. Amen.